Welcome to this presentation called Mind the Gap, Finding the Missing Child, a Case Study, or What Can Be Uncovered in Cemetery Records. Here is Joseph Telfer Hutchinson and his wife Elizabeth Helen Buckley, who were married in England in 1892, and they have two children, Mabel in 1894 and a Zoe in 1900. Notice there's a 6-year gap between these children. Back in that time, it was usual to have children every 2 or 3 years. So there may be a missing child. So we're going to look for this missing child and see if we can unite them with their family. I noticed that Joseph and Elizabeth are living in England in this period between 1860s and early the 20th century. So I know that in the 1911 census, there's some information about the number of children that are going to be in the home found on the 1911 census. So I'm going to search the 1911 census. So here's the page for them. At this time, the enumerator would actually hand a sheet of paper to each household, and the head of the household or someone else would fill this out. And they'd include things like the profession and occupation, as well as the birthplace of every person in the home. How many rooms were in the house? Here we have 8, which is a larger than normal for that time. And the signature of the person who filled it out and the postal address. Now we find our Elizabeth Helen Hutchinson on row 6 here. So we're going to zoom in on the left side of the page. There's Elizabeth Helen Hutchinson. She's listed as sister-in-law, meaning she's sister-in-law to Charles Leonard Tack, who's the head of the household on row 1. That would make Marjorie Elizabeth's sister, older by 2 years. Also, you see with Elizabeth, she has her youngest daughter, Zoe, living with her, but her husband and oldest daughter are not shown on this one. But what's really interesting is on this right-hand side where it says that she is married. If her husband had been dead, we would have said widowed here instead of married. Tells how long they've been married. 19 years married. They had 3 children born alive. 2 children are still living, and 1 child has died. So we know that 1 child has died before 1911, and we saw that we have 2 children listed on the family tree. So we know there's a 3rd child out there. So first thing I'll do is look at the oldest child's birth record. So we did have the baptismal record for Mabel, who was born in 1894. And when we look at the top of this page, it shows that it was baptism solemnized in St. James Church in Toxteth Park, which is a suburb of Liverpool. And it has down here Mabel and Joseph and Margaret Hutchinson. So there's her baptism date. And the vicar was kind enough to actually write in the birth date here. Now, what I could do is go back to this record and start paging through it to see if I can find the child between this date in 1894 and 1900. But there's another way that saves me some searching, paging and paging. And besides, they may have moved between those children. So I'm going to look at the actual record set. So this source citation down here shows that they're from the Liverpool Record Office. So I'm going to go search the collection in Ancestry. Under search, we go to the card catalog. And then once in the card catalog, I can put Liverpool, England here. And then I'm looking at the record sets that come up, and this is the one I'm looking for. It's the Liverpool, England Church of England baptisms from 1813 to 1911. You can see there's over 2.5 million records here. So this is more than just a single parish in Liverpool. It's probably all Liverpool parishes within that more than 100-year period. So I click on that Liverpool, England Church title, and I go to the search page for this record set. So I put the last name of the child in. I could leave that blank because I'm just going to be searching for the parents' names here. So I put in the minimum amount I think is required. So Joseph, I don't use his middle name Telfer, but I do put in Hutchinson, which is key. And then I put in his wife's first name, Elizabeth. I don't even use her middle name as Helen. So with just the father's name and the mother's first name, I do a search. And here's my results. So here's my Mabel that I had before, who was baptized in 1894 in St. James in Toxteth. Her parents are Joseph Telfer and Elizabeth Helen. But there's another child here now born in 1895, the first row here. It says Private Gertrude Buckley Hutchinson. So private's a bit unusual, but we'll discover what that means in just a moment. But you see here, it's also in Toxteth, but it's now in a different parish. So St. James Church here, St. James Parish, and now it's St. Philemon. So I'm glad I didn't spend my time just searching through St. James. I wouldn't have found it there. So I can actually view the record now for Gertrude Buckley. And here it is. There's the page, the baptismal page. This is the indexed information for her. Her record is actually in the bottom of the right-hand page here. So when we zoom in and look at that, again, they kindly gave us the birth date. Here's the baptismal date. You can see Gertrude Buckley here and her parents' names and the street address, which was 34 Carter Street. So it's always good to know where they lived. It helps to distinguish between families maybe with similar names. And also the occupation for Joseph. He is a corn dealer. And corn dealer was more a generic name for any sort of grains. So it could be wheat or oats or barley or rye. He was a dealer in that. And then the clergyman's name here, Thomas Wright, the one who performed the baptism. Now, this word private, typically private, now the typical process was that you'd have the baby at home, and then within the next few weeks or months, or I've seen it even years later, they take them to the church and have them baptized or christened. Now, in the case where the child was not well and thought they might die before they had a chance to be baptized, they'd call the clergyman in and have a private baptism in the home. So that's what this word private means. They actually brought the clergyman in and had little Gertrude baptized somewhere between, about a month after, exactly a month after she was born. So she probably wasn't doing very well, and were afraid maybe she might not make it, so they had her baptized at home. That's what private is. All right, so I like to look at old maps to see where these people live. So this is a map of Lower Liverpool. That big red arrow is pointing to Carter Street. And if we zoom in on Carter Street, we can see this is a great old map from the National Library of Scotland. So if you're ever looking for old maps of the UK, this is great. They have different choices of maps that you can have, and they're actually quite detailed. If you look at this one, you can see Carter Street is laid out here. Even the individual houses are here. They're not numbered though, so I don't really know where number 34 is. But I do see other landmarks, the Greek church here, St. Margaret's Church, and the Jewish synagogue is right here. I often like to look now at a modern map to see if these houses are still standing, because if they are, it's nice to look at the outside of what the house looks like today. So here's the satellite view of that same street. So you can see here's Carter Street, but you can see it's all changed. All the houses have been torn down and they've been rebuilt. In fact, Berkeley Road, which was a bigger road, has actually been closed and just grown in over here. So I won't be able to go and look at what the original house looked like, but I do see that it's still in that neighborhood, because here's the Greek Orthodox Church, St. Margaret's Church, and the synagogue. So let's go now to find a grave. So we know that we have a child who died sometime after 1895 and before 1911. So I'm going to look for a grave for Gertrude Buckley Hutchinson and put in her birth year as 1895, and then I do a search. And sure enough, there is a Gertrude Buckley Hutchinson listed in Find a Grave. It has her birth date exactly as we found it in the baptismal record, but now we have a death date, 30th of October, 1895. So just 3 months after she was born, she passed away. So indeed, that private baptism was probably well-meaning, because she was sickly. And then she's buried in Toxteth Park Cemetery. And it tells us where the actual plot is. She's in the consecrated section H, grave 867 of that cemetery. So I can go back to my map and find out where Toxteth Park Cemetery is. So here's Carter Street over here. Here's Toxteth Park Cemetery, quite a large cemetery, has about 170-some thousand burials in it. And it's about 1 mile from where Gertrude was. So clearly that was a convenient cemetery for them. Now, also on Find a Grave, just to the left of where the name is, usually there's a place for a tombstone photo, and Gertrude didn't have one. So if you're signed up for a free membership of Find a Grave, you get some extra benefits. I can actually click this button down here to request a photo, and when I do that, I get to fill out a form. It tells me that there are 46 volunteers who people who are members of Find a Grave or who said they'd go and look up a stone. But I also saw that there's still about 80 outstanding photos. So I thought, well, even with 46 volunteers, if there's still outstanding 80 photos, I might have to wait a while. So I put down Gertrude's name in here and the plot number and so on, and included my email. Then I sent off my request, not knowing when it would come back. But hey, the very next day, we get this picture added to Gertrude's profile in Find a Grave, and it's this stone here. It says, an affectionate remembrance of William T. Carter, who died in 1876, aged 29. She says 30 years, I think. 29, looks like, yeah. And then a John Sanderson, who died in, looks like 1884, who was 76 years old. Now, I don't see Gertrude Buckley's name on this stone. So made me wonder, is this the right stone after all? You know, so I can actually click here on Robert Anderson, the one who added the photo, and I sent him an email and I asked him, hey, thank you for the photo and the quick reply, but I don't see Gertrude's name on the tombstone. Is this really the correct grave? Again, a day or so later, I get a reply back from him, and he says, yes, that is the correct headstone. Gertrude was interred in that section and plot number. And that is the headstone at that location. Then he says you can check the entries for Carter and Sanderson, the names that are on the stone, in the registers. Okay, so I hadn't checked cemetery registers before, so I thought, let's see if they're available. So I go into Family Search, and I go to their catalog. So in the Family Search catalog, I can then search by place. So I put in England, Lancashire, Liverpool, and the keyword is Toxteth, because that's the name of the cemetery, or at least the district. And when I do that, and I went down to the part that has cemeteries and clicked on cemeteries, 7 entries opened up. And 2 were of great interest: the burial register for the actual cemetery where she's buried, and a burial order book. Don't know what that is, but also in that same cemetery. So they run from 1856, and that's when the cemetery actually opened, right up into, you know, the 70s here, but 1901 here for the burial order books. So I started off by looking at the burial register, and when I click on that, it opens up several films for that register. It's a long register because there's many entries, and they go right from 1856 when it opened right to up to 1925 on film. The film I'm interested in is 1895. That's the year that Gertrude died. So I'm going to go look at this film. Now on the right-hand side, there's different icons that indicate what I'll find. So if it shows a camera like this, it means that there are images, but there is no magnifying glass above there. If they had been indexed, they put a magnifying glass. That means I could actually search an index to find the entry for them, make it easier to find. Notice also that this last one here, from 1910 to 1925, doesn't have a camera icon. It has a reel. It means that this film can only be viewed at the Family Search Center in Salt Lake, or Family Search Library in Salt Lake. So can't view that, likely because of privacy laws. See, they're within the last 100 years, at least, where the film ends, and so they probably close it because of privacy. But why, you might ask, is this first film also not visible online? Because that's from 1856 to 58. Well, the answer is this is item number 3 on that microfilm. Microfilm was expensive back when they were doing it, and still is today, even more so. So they don't use microfilm anymore. But back then, they wouldn't waste partial film. They would fill up the whole roll. So if they'd finished one record set, they would just add the next record set onto the same film. So, you know, items 1 and 2 on that film probably had some information that cannot be viewed at this time. So that's why that record is locked. All right. So I click on this icon of the camera here, and I go to the actual register of burials in the consecrated part in Toxteth Park Cemetery. So I didn't need to be indexed because these registers are in chronological order. So I just had to flip to the year 1895. The tombstone told me that she was buried on the 30th of October of that year, and this is the last entry here, the 30th of October. It's very hard to read, so I've just put a transcript underneath. So this is the registration number, the date, her name, her age when she died, her rank or profession just listed as infant, has 34 Carter Street, so that matches her Birth record exactly. Toxteth Park is her neighborhood or parish district. Subsequent. So when it says mode of burial, it says subsequent. So I'm looking here, others, what do others say? Some say single and some say subsequent. So I'm thinking subsequent must just mean another person buried in the same plot, which makes sense because there's two names on that gravestone already, but not Gertrude's. Tells me H867 is the plot, which is right. Thomas Wright, okay, the same minister who was at her baptism officiated at the cemetery when she was buried. I also notice on this one here from October 25th to the 30th, I counted how many infants died. There's one here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 infants out of the 11 or so on this page died. So probably some nasty plagues, not necessarily plague, but some diseases going around. Could be rheumatic fever, cholera. I checked the newspapers around that time for Liverpool. There were mentions of people dying of those kind of diseases, but I think it was just a daily part of life. If we had that kind of death rate today, there'd be major news on it. All right, so I've done looking at the register. So what's in the order book. So I went to the burial order books. It covers mostly the same period, and certainly the period I'm interested in. And then they again were listed in chronological order. So I found it. So there's the same registration number and the date of October 30th, 1895. And it tells me the time of day that the funeral took place. So, or at least the burial, 12:30 p.m. There's her full name, her age in months, that she's an infant. And here's our 34 Carter Street again, the Toxteth Park, subsequent. So this is all the information that has then been put onto the register. So the register is made from this information. And so it's good to look at this because there's some additional information. So down at the bottom, dated 2 days prior to the actual burial, it shows a William Sanderson, and then subsequent interment, removed sides, and ditto the plants, remove the plants. And there's a charge here, 14 shillings for the interment or the sub-interment, and 5 shillings and 3 shillings for the removal of the sides. So what this is a payment for the burial. And this William Sanderson was really the owner of that plot. So we saw that there was a John Sanderson in that plot already, along with a William T. Carter. So we know that there was 3 people buried. So I wanted to see, well, who's this William T. Carter, the first one buried? So I looked up his burial order. And so he was buried almost 20 years earlier in 1876, and Gertrude was 1895. So here it is, a William T. Carter, who's 29 years old, a foreman miller. And then here's his address, Weston Street. Again, it says freehold grave now. You can see this one is subsequent, freehold grave. And then when we look down here, the information, it does say Mr. William Sanderson again, and the freehold grave, it was £4 to bury him in there. And then the other information is 3 shillings to do that. Now, what I did notice at the very top was an address written here. Don't know why they wrote it there, but it says 40 Carter Street, which is just 3 doors down from our 34 Carter Street. So a neighbor for sure would be there. Now, is this a relative? Don't have enough information, but possibly a relative. I don't know whether the practice was to bury people in, subsequently in a grave that they might have just purchased to allow them to be buried, or whether it was a family plot. So we're going to take a look some more. All right. Now I'm curious of what £4, 3 shillings would be. So here's a web page where you can actually do an inflation calculator to see what it was. So when I put in that amount in 1876, by the end of 2022, it would have been worth £565 and change. So, it sounds like £4 is pretty cheap, and it's still pretty cheap. It's only £500 to bury them. But you can see how inflation has caused our money to be inflated. All right, so if we look down here in this graph on the right, it's quite interesting. You see from 1876, the first 40 years, to 1916, there's 0 inflation really. And then there's a little bump there for World War I, and then not much happening until the build up just before World War II. Now you can see the inflation is getting pretty, getting to rise at a shallow angle. So we hit early 70s. soon as we hit early 70s, you can see this thing just skyrocket, 45-degree angle straight up for inflation. So if you think your money isn't buying what it used to, you're right. And we've been since 1970, the last 50 years in, staggering inflation. Would it be nice to be in an area where there is zero inflation? You know what your dollar would buy. So that's just a fun site you can try if you're looking at what money would be worth today from days ago. All right, so I went back to Find a Grave to find this William T. Carter and Find a Grave, and sure enough, I found his grave. Actually, a different photo at a different angle, so there was already a photo of that grave. But look what I found: William Telfer Carter. So Telfer is Gertrude's father's middle name. So this is also a middle name. So we know that there's a Telfer line for as a connection. So this is a family connection on this tombstone here. Even though it said T, you couldn't tell until I looked at this detailed information on Find a Grave. So that says, well, now I want to find out how these people might be related. This is kind of an interesting story. So I did do so now I go back to the family. I can actually finish off this family now by adding Gertrude Buckley Hutchinson, born and died in 1895, and add her to there. And then I added all of these sources that I found. So her birth record, and I found death records, and I found burial registers and the burial order book and so on. So there's quite a few sources just for someone who only lived 3 months old, and they're all attached to her tree now. I did do Google also Toxteth Park Cemetery, because usually the city has a site. This is not a city site. This is actually a private site that somebody's put together. And I look who put it together is Robert Anderson, Robert and Rose Anderson. Robert Anderson was the same name as the fellow who replied and took the photo for me out of the graveyard. So he's probably very involved in maintaining this site, as well as working with Find a Grave to help answer people's questions. So it's a large cemetery. I know that Gertrude was buried in Section H, so I click on Section H. Takes me to a map of section of the whole cemetery, and Section H is right down here. All right, so there we go. And this little red square is about where her grave is. I could tell because there's also another map, which is a plot map of that Section H. I've got it upside down because it's the same orientation as on the other map. But you can read it, 867 is the grave number here, the actual plot. The S stands for the side of the grave, or where the stone is. So the stone is right there on the grave. So I always like to see if I can find out, get an image of it. So here's a satellite image of the whole cemetery. It's quite nice from above. You can see, and this square here would be whereabouts Gertrude's grave is. If I zoom in a little closer, you can see her grave is around here. And look at all of the stones that have fallen over. These are large headstones. So many have toppled over. And there's a sign I could see on Street View, and I walked through the gates using Street View on this cemetery. Sign saying that be careful, don't let your children play around these headstones because they're unstable. They could fall over. And the cemetery is not responsible for writing up, for resetting these stones. It's the person who had purchased the grave or their descendants should be maintaining this. So you can see many aren't bothering to, they might not have a descendant to help with the stones. So they're just laying flat. Probably take some public funds to reset these stones. Now this red square up here on the path, there actually is a Google Street View from here. So the next image you'll see is from this spot, looking towards this tree here. And just before the tree is where Gertrude's stone would be. So there's the tree. So Gertrude's stone is just right in there. So you can see how large these stones are. Very similar look of all of these, although there's differences. That one looks like a replacement stone rather than the original. Some of these are broken off. Many have fallen down. You can just see how many fallen stones there are. So quite interesting. But that's as close as I can get to the stone using Street View. Now, whenever I find a grave on Find a Grave, I like to just click on the actual cemetery name, and then I can search for others of that same last name in that cemetery. And when I searched for Hutchinsons, there's over 90. So it's hard for me to tell who's related or not. Didn't see a whole lot of ones. But there's some other search options. I thought, well, if Gertrude is the third person buried in that cemetery plot, could there be others? Now, if I click on more search options here, there's actually an area that says plot, where I can enter the plot number. So I enter section H, grave 867, and hey, sure enough, there are 5 people buried there. So we have the William Telfer, who was the first buried in 1876, then a John Sanderson in 1884, and then Gertrude was in 1895, and then an Elizabeth Sanderson, so the same name as this Sanderson, and she was buried just about a year after Gertrude. And then finally a William Sanderson. That was the name of the man who was one who had purchased the grave originally. So in 1904, he was the last one in, and we had 5 people altogether. Notice the little symbol here. There's a question mark. So there's no photo when we go to Elizabeth Sanderson's Find a Grave, or Elizabeth or Williams. There's no photo. And Gertrude was like that too. There was no one until they added the photo. And these people are on Find a Grave with the photo. So I wanted to take a look at Elizabeth Sanderson and William Sanderson to see what more I could find of them. So this is her the order book entry for Elizabeth Sanderson. She died when she's 81 years old as a widow. Now look at the address, 34 Carter Street, the exact same address. So this person was living at the same address that Gertrude was, who died the year before. So now I think this is more than a neighbor. This is definitely a family member. And so I want to find out who that family member is. Again, a subsequent burial, same plot number. And then again, the cost of her interment, removing the tombstone, actually remove the tombstone and remove the plants. And so there we go. So if she's 81 years old in 1896, she would have been born about 1815. So I want to find who this Elizabeth was who married this Sanderson, born in 1815. Now we see that William Carter was a Telfer. So I'm guessing Elizabeth may be a Telfer as well, who married a Sanderson. So I'm going to look on my tree to see if that person can be found. But let's look at William first. So William didn't have an order book because there wasn't one for that date, but there was a registry of his burial. And so there it is. He died as buried in 1904. There's his name. He has died and he's 75 years old. Now, was this a husband of Elizabeth? So maybe this William Sanderson is her Elizabeth's husband. And then his profession was a rag merchant. Not sure how much money was in being a rag merchant, but there you have it. Okay, so let's take a look to see our tree now, to see, here's our Gertrude that we've just added. And we want to find out who this Elizabeth, which we think is a Telfer, born in 1815 would be. So here's the Telfer line, goes up this way. So here's Anne Telfer. And then we have this William Telfer, who married a Jane Fleming, and they were married in 1811. So a child born in 1815 would be right in line with this couple. So I click on children here to see the download of the children, or the expanded children. So we had 2 Elizabeths, one that was born in 1812, and then one in 1815. So this one probably died, and then the next child they renamed. So this is the exact dates that we're looking for: 1815 for birth date, and there she was buried in 1896. So this is likely our Elizabeth Telfer. We found her from that grave. So I searched for a marriage record, and I did find a marriage record of a William Sanderson to Elizabeth Telfer on the 9th of December, 1860. They were married in the parish church of Liverpool. Okay, so that's the right place, the right names, the right dates. Now it shows he was a widower. So our Elizabeth married this widower. And if we looked at the dates, we actually find out that Elizabeth is about 10 or 11 years older than this William Sanderson. If you look back on the tombstone dates and said what their age were and when they were buried. So, he married an older woman after his wife died. Okay, so this is his signature here. And she couldn't write, so she just put an X. So this is her mark. She just put an X. Somebody else wrote her name down there. Now look at the witnesses. We have John Hutchinson and an Anne Telfer. So if we go back here, we see here's John Hutchinson, Anne Telfer. So Anne, you can't see it, it's off the bottom of this page, but Anne is her youngest sister. So born in 34. So Elizabeth is born in 1815, so almost 20 years younger. Is Anne, Elizabeth's younger sister, and her soon-to-be husband, John Hutchinson, because these two married in 1861, and the marriage we're looking at is in 1860. So here they are, they're together, signing as witnesses, soon to be a married couple themselves. Now, one more thing to check. I went to the 1861 census looking for Elizabeth, who's now a Sanderson. I find her with her husband, William, who's only 36 and she's 45. Remember, that's his second marriage. And this daughter, Sanderson, says his daughter of William is 5 years old. So this may be one of the reasons why William was anxious to marry. He had a 5-year-old daughter from his first wife. And when his wife died, he wanted some help probably, and as well as some companionship of another wife. So he married Elizabeth, and Elizabeth then would be in that family to help raise his daughter. All right, so we've learned a lot from one simple missing child who died at 3 months. We found quite a bit of information from there. So really our conclusion is, when working with cemetery records, dig a little deeper. You may be surprised at what you'll find. Thank you for watching.